Soviet space dogs. During the 1950s and 1960s, the Soviet space program used dogs for suborbital and orbital space flights to determine whether human spaceflight was feasible. These dogs, including Laika, the first animal to orbit Earth, were surgically modified to provide the necessary information for human survival in space. The Soviet space program typically used female dogs due to their anatomical compatibility with the spacesuit. Similarly, they used mixed-breed dogs due to their apparent hardiness. In this period, the Soviet Union launched missions with passenger slots for at least 57 dogs. Some dogs flew more than once. Most survived. Those that died were lost mostly through technical failures, according to the parameters of the test. Laika was an exception and was expected to die during her Earth orbiting 3 November 1957 Sputnik 2. Training. Dogs were the preferred animal for the experiments because scientists felt dogs were well suited to endure long periods of inactivity. As part of their training, they were confined in small boxes for 15 to 20 days at a time. Stray dogs, rather than animals accustomed to living in a house, were chosen because the scientists felt they would be able to tolerate the rigorous and extreme stresses of spaceflight better than other dogs. Female dogs were used because of their temperament and because the suit the dogs wore in order to collect urine and feces was equipped with a special device, designed to work only with females. Their training included standing still for long periods of time, wearing spacesuits, being placed in simulators that acted like a rocket during launch, riding in centrifuges that simulated the high acceleration of a rocket launch and being kept in progressively smaller cages to prepare them for the confines of the space module. Dogs that flew in orbit were fed a nutritious jelly-like protein. This was high in fiber and assisted the dogs to defecate during long periods of time while in their small space module. More than 60% of dogs to enter space were reportedly suffering from constipation and gallstones on arrival back to base. Suborbital flights. Dogs were flown to an altitude of 100 kilometers, 62 miles, on board 15 scientific flights on R-1 rockets, itself a copy of the German V-2, from 1951 to 1956. The dogs wore pressure suits with acrylic glass bubble helmets. From 1957 to 1960, 11 flights with dogs were made on the R-2A series, developed from the R-1 missile, and once again, itself a copy of the German V-2, which flew to about 200 kilometers, 120 miles. 3 flights were made to an altitude of about 450 kilometers, 280 miles, on R-5A rockets in 1958. In the R-2 and R-5 rockets, the dogs were contained in a pressured cabin. Dezik, Tsygan, and Lisa 1. Dezik, and Tsygan, Gypsy, were the first dogs to make a suborbital flight on 15 August 1951. Both dogs were recovered unharmed after traveling to a maximum altitude of 110 kilometers, 68 miles. Dezik made another suborbital flight in 1951 with the first dog named Lisa, Fox, although neither survived because the parachute failed to deploy. After the death of Dezik, Tsygan was adopted as a pet by Soviet physicist Anatoly Blagoravov. Lisa 2 and Ryzhik. Lisa 2, Lisa, Fox, or Vixen, and Ryzhik, Ginger, red-haired, flew to an altitude of 100 kilometers, 62 miles, on 2 June 1954. Smelaya and Malyshka. Smelar, brave, or courageous, femme, was due to make a flight in September but ran away the day before the launch. She was found the next day and went on to make a successful flight with a dog named Malyshka, baby. They both crashed after the rocket failed to deploy a parachute, and were found the next day by the recovery team. Bobik and ZIB. Bobik, common Russian name for a small dog, ran away just days before her flight was scheduled to take place on 15 September 1961. A replacement named ZIB, a Russian acronym for substitute for missing Bobik, Zamena Iskeznavsemu Bobiku, who was an untrained street dog found running around the barracks, was quickly located and made a successful flight to 100 kilometers and back. Otvazhnaya and Snezhinka. Otvazhnaya, Brave One, Fem. Made a flight on the 2nd of July 1959 along with a rabbit named Marfusa, Little Martha, and another dog named Snezhinka, Snowflake. She went on to make 5 other flights between 1959 and 1960. Albina and Tsyganka. Albina, and Tsyganka, Gypsy Girl, made a flight on June 7, 1958, and were both ejected out of their capsule at an altitude of 85 kilometers, 53 miles, and landed safely. Albina was one of the dogs shortlisted for Sputnik 2, but never flew in orbit. Damka and Krasavka. Damka, Queen of Checkers, and Krasavka, Little Beauty, or Belladonna, were to make an orbital flight on the 22nd of December 1960 as a part of the Vostok program, which also included mice. However, their mission was marked by a string of equipment failures. The upper stage rocket failed and the craft re-entered the atmosphere after reaching a suborbital apogee of 214 kilometers, 133 miles. In the event of unscheduled return to the surface, the craft was to eject the dogs and self-destruct, but the ejection seat failed and the primary destruct mechanism shorted out. The animals were thus still in the intact capsule when it returned to the surface. The backup self-destruct mechanism was set to a 60-hour timer, so a team was quickly sent out to locate and recover the capsule. Although the capsule was reached in deep snow on the first day, there was insufficient remaining daylight to disarm the self-destruct mechanism and open the capsule. The team could only report that the window was frosted over in the -43 degrees Celsius, -45 degrees Fahrenheit, degree temperatures, and no signs of life were detected. On the second day, however, the dogs were heard barking as the capsule was opened. The dogs were wrapped in sheepskin coats and flown to Moscow alive, though all the mice aboard the capsule were found dead because of the cold. Damka was also known as Sutka, Joke, or Zhemtyuzhnaya, Pearly, and Krasavka was also known as Kometka, Little Comet, or Zulka, Cheetah. After this incident, Krasavka was adopted by Oleg Gurzenko, a leading Soviet scientist working with animals used in space flights. She went on to have puppies and continued living with Gurzenko and his family until her death 14 years later. After the incident, Sergei Korolev, who was the designer of the rocket, wanted to make the story public, but was prevented from doing so by state censorship. Bars and Lisichka. Bars, Prawn, Bars, Snow Leopard, and Lisichka, Little Fox, were also on a mission to orbit as a part of the Vostok program, but died after their rocket exploded 28.5 seconds into the launch on the 28th of July 1960. Bars was also known as Chaika, Koiko, Seagull. Other dogs that flew on suborbital flights include Damka, Smoky, Modnitsa, Fashionista, and Koziavka, Buga. At least 4 other dogs flew in September 1961, and 2 or more were lost. Orbital flights. Laika. On 3 November 1957, Loiko, Barker, flew to space on Sputnik 2 to become the first Earth-born creature, other than microbes, to orbit the planet. Many suborbital flights with animal passengers had already been to space, such as the 1949 mission of the rhesus macaque Albert II. Laika was also known as Zhuchka, Zucker, Little Bug, and Limonchik, Little Lemon. The American media dubbed her Mutnik, making a play on words for the canine follow-on to the first orbital mission, Sputnik. She died between 5 and 7 hours into the flight from stress and overheating. Laika's true cause of death was not made public until October 2002. Officials previously gave reports that she died when the oxygen supply ran out. At a Moscow press conference in 1998, Oleg Gurzenko, a senior Soviet scientist involved in the project, stated, "The more time passes, the more I'm sorry about it. We did not learn enough from the mission to justify the death of the dog." Belka and Strelka. Belka, literally, squirrel, or alternatively, whitey, and Strelka, Strelka, Little Arrow, spent a day in space aboard Korabl Sputnik 2, Sputnik 5, on 19 August 1960 before safely returning to Earth. They are the first higher living organisms to survive orbit in outer space. They were accompanied by a gray rabbit, 42 mice, 2 rats, flies and several plants and fungi. All passengers survived. They were the first Earth-born creatures to go into orbit and return alive, and gave birth to many descendants. Pchyolka and Mushka. Pchyolka, Pchyolka, little bee, and Mushka, Muska, little fly, spent a day in orbit on 1 December 1960 on board Korabl Sputnik 3, Sputnik 6, with other animals, plants and insects. Due to a re-entry error when the retro rockets failed to shut off when planned, their spacecraft was intentionally destroyed by remote self-destruct to prevent foreign powers from inspecting the capsule. Mushka was one of the 3 dogs trained for Sputnik 2 and was used during ground tests. She did not fly on Sputnik 2 because she refused to eat properly. Chernushka, Chernushka, Blackie, made one orbit on board Korabl Sputnik 4, Sputnik 9, on 9 March 1961 with a cosmonaut dummy, whom Soviet officials nicknamed Ivan Ivanovich, mice and a guinea pig. The dummy was ejected out of the capsule during re-entry and made a soft landing using a parachute. Chernushka was recovered unharmed inside the capsule. Zvyozdochka, Zvyozdochka, Starlet, who was named by Yuri Gagarin, made one orbit on board Korabl Sputnik 5 on 25 March 1961 with a wooden cosmonaut dummy, and other animals in the final practice flight before Gagarin's historic flight on 12 April. Again, the dummy was ejected out of the capsule while Zvyozdochka remained inside. Both were recovered successfully. Veterok and Ugolyok. Veterok, Light Breeze, and Ugolyok, Ember, were launched on the 22nd of February 1966 on board Cosmos 110, and spent 21 days in orbit before landing on the 16th of March. This spaceflight of record-breaking duration was not surpassed by humans until Soyuz 11 in June 1971 and still stands as the longest spaceflight by dogs. The 2 dogs showed signs of cardiovascular deconditioning, with dehydration, weight loss, loss of muscle and coordination, and took several weeks to fully recover, though they showed no long-term issues.